What if the man America feared most was never chasing power at all, but only searching for God? Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's Figures story, we walk with a man whose life was a storm, violent in its youth, disciplined in its middle, and tragically cut short just as he was stepping into the calm of truth. Tonight, we ask, when the world writes your story for you, can you take back the pen and let God be the author? Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, into a world already suspicious of his existence. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and an outspoken supporter of Marcus Garvey's movement for black self-reliance. His mother, Louise, was a proud, educated woman from Grenada, fluent in multiple languages and fiercely protective of her children. Together, they built a home that valued dignity, faith, and purpose. But in America of the 1920s, those values were seen as a threat when they came from black voices that refused to bow. The threats began early. Men in white hoods standing outside their home, police visits without cause, neighbors whispering. Malcolm's earliest memories were painted in contrasts: his father's booming sermons about pride and his mother's steady voice reading scripture, always under the shadow of danger. One night, the danger came to their doorstep. The Littles' home was set ablaze by members of the Black Legion, a white supremacist group. The family barely escaped. For Malcolm, the memory of running barefoot into the night, smoke in his lungs, would stay with him forever. It was his first taste of what hate could do. They moved, but safety didn't follow. In 1931, when Malcolm was just 6 years old, his father's body was found beside a streetcar track, skull fractured, body mangled. The police called it an accident. The Littles knew it was murder. But grief in that era for a black family was a private thing. No justice, no trial, just a quiet burial, and the cold fact that the man who had been their shield was gone. Malcolm's mother, Louise, tried to hold the family together. She took on odd jobs, grew vegetables, cooked meals that stretched farther than they should. But grief is heavy, and prejudice makes it heavier. Social workers began circling, questioning her ability to care for her children. Slowly, the weight broke her down. When Malcolm was 12, she was committed to a mental institution, and the children were scattered into foster care. Malcolm found himself in a world that didn't expect much from him, and told him so to his face. In school, he excelled academically. He dreamed aloud of becoming a lawyer. One day, a teacher he respected pulled him aside and said, "Malcolm, be realistic. You can be good with your hands. Why not a carpenter?" The words weren't advice. They were a verdict. That moment planted something in Malcolm. Not just anger, but a conviction. If society had already decided his worth, he would decide his own terms, and those terms would not be bound by anyone's approval. By 15, Malcolm had traded textbooks for the street hustle. First in Boston, living with his older half-sister Ella. Then in Harlem, he became known for his style and wit. Zoot suits, sharp shoes, a conch hairstyle. It was a performance of confidence, and people believed it. But behind the charm was a young man running from the vulnerability of his past. Harlem gave him everything fast: gambling, running numbers, dealing in stolen goods. The rush was addictive, the money intoxicating. For a while, it felt like he had outsmarted the fate the world had written for him. But the streets have a way of cashing in debts, and Malcolm's bill was coming due. In January 1946, after a string of burglaries in Boston, Malcolm was arrested alongside his friend and a young woman. The sentence was harsh: 10 years. As the cell door closed behind him, the air turned heavy. The noise of the streets was replaced by the metallic echo of a world that offered no exits. At first, he wore his prison number like another suit, acting tough, showing no fear. But prison has a way of stripping away the performances. In the quiet hours, Malcolm's thoughts caught up to him. The faces of his parents, the voice of his teacher, the sting of every loss. They all sat with him in that cell. And a question began to form. Was this really the sum of his life? He didn't know it yet, but God was already moving pieces he couldn't see. Prison can be a place where men break, or where they begin to rebuild. For Malcolm, it started as the first. The first months were a test of pride. He clashed with guards, mouthed off to older inmates, and refused to bow to the authority that had taken away his freedom. He carried himself like a man who didn't care, but inside he was restless. The nights were the worst, when the lights dimmed and there was nothing but the sound of footsteps in the corridor and the faint hum of radiators. That was when his mind would wander to the fire that had burned his childhood home, to the steel wheels that had crushed his father, to the cold, locked doors that had swallowed his mother. He began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: stillness. And stillness can be dangerous for a man used to running. It forces you to face yourself. One afternoon, a letter arrived from his brother Filbert. It was short, the handwriting firm. "Malcolm, the white man's world is a trap. There's a truth bigger than these walls, and you need to find it. The Nation of Islam is the way." Malcolm tossed it aside at first. Religion? That was a game for preachers who wanted your money, or politicians who wanted your loyalty. But the letters kept coming, not just from Filbert, but from his sister Hilda and his brother Reginald. They spoke of a man named Elijah Muhammad, who taught that the black man was the original man, that God had not abandoned them, and that self-discipline could break chains stronger than steel. The words planted a seed. And then something else happened. Malcolm discovered the prison library. It started with curiosity. He would read history, philosophy, language. Then he became obsessed. He copied the entire dictionary by hand, page by page, to learn every word. He studied the lives of leaders and revolutions. It wasn't just knowledge, it was power, and it was his. But the Nation of Islam's teachings brought a different kind of power. Reginald visited him one day and said, "You've been running from who you are, Malcolm. It's time to stop." Something in the way he said it, calm, certain, made Malcolm listen. He began writing to Elijah Muhammad directly. To his surprise, Elijah wrote back, encouraging him to purify his habits, to stop smoking, to eat only one meal a day, to study the truth. It was a discipline Malcolm had never known before. Slowly, the hustler's swagger gave way to a minister's precision. He stopped swearing. He stopped gambling. He stopped wasting hours on petty arguments. He began to speak to other inmates about the teachings he was learning, and they listened, not because of his title, but because he spoke with conviction. By the time he walked out of prison in August 1952, after serving 6 years, he was not Malcolm Little anymore. He was Malcolm X. The X was a symbol of the African name stolen from his ancestors, of the identity the world had denied him, of the man he had yet to fully become. He didn't just want to rebuild his life. He wanted to rebuild the world around him. His first stop was Detroit, where he met Elijah Muhammad in person for the first time. Elijah was smaller than Malcolm expected, his voice soft, almost gentle. But his presence commanded attention. When Malcolm spoke of his desire to serve, Elijah smiled and said, "Brother Malcolm, you can be great in this work, but greatness comes with discipline." And so began Malcolm's life as a minister in the Nation of Islam. He was assigned to Temple No. 1 in Detroit, then quickly sent to other cities to help expand the movement. His speeches were electric. He spoke without notes, weaving history, scripture, and personal experience into a force that drew crowds. He didn't just preach against the sins of the flesh, he preached against the sin of accepting less than God intended for you. It was a fire people couldn't ignore. Within 2 years, he had founded or expanded temples in Boston, Philadelphia, and Harlem. The Nation of Islam's membership grew faster than ever before. The press took notice, and so did the FBI. Files began to thicken with his name. For Malcolm, this wasn't a threat. It was confirmation he was doing something right. The world was finally listening. But he didn't see yet that in the world he was building, admiration could turn to jealousy, and loyalty could turn to rivalry. God had brought him out of the cell. But the next test would come from inside the very movement he had given his life to. In the early 1950s, Malcolm X was like a spark in dry grass. Wherever he went, something ignited. His style was unlike other ministers in the Nation of Islam. He didn't lecture from a distance. He spoke like a man who had walked through the same fire his audience was still in. In Harlem, he took over Temple Number 7. It was a modest storefront space when he arrived, with rows of worn chairs and a handful of faithful members. Within months, the room was overflowing. The nation's teachings were strict. No alcohol, no pork, modest dress, complete separation from mainstream politics. But under Malcolm's voice, they sounded less like restrictions and more like liberation. He told young men to straighten their backs, to stop numbing themselves with liquor and gambling. He told women to see themselves as queens, deserving respect. He told everyone to reject the lie that they were powerless. And when he spoke about the history of oppression, it wasn't abstract. He made it personal. His sermons began to spread beyond the temple walls. Word traveled to Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Soon, Elijah Muhammad was sending Malcolm to cities that needed new temples, trusting him to plant seeds where others had failed. Each time, Malcolm brought discipline and charisma in equal measure. He was up before dawn, fasting regularly, studying late into the night. But his rising profile didn't just attract followers. It drew the attention of law enforcement. FBI agents began attending his speeches, notebooks in hand. Newspapers wrote about him, sometimes with awe, often with alarm. They called him the angriest black man in America, a title that made his enemies nod in agreement and his supporters smile with pride. Inside the nation, Malcolm's star was undeniable. He was now the most visible minister after Elijah Muhammad himself. And with visibility came influence. People began to see Malcolm not just as a representative of Elijah Muhammad, but as a leader in his own right. That kind of recognition is dangerous in any hierarchy. Some ministers whispered that Malcolm was too ambitious, that he loved the cameras too much, that his loyalty to Elijah was not as pure as it seemed. Malcolm heard the whispers, but he brushed them aside. He believed his loyalty was beyond question. Then came a moment that tested that belief. During a private dinner at Elijah Muhammad's home in Chicago, Malcolm sat quietly while other ministers discussed the growing attention from the media. One suggested that Malcolm should slow down, let others share the spotlight. Elijah listened, then turned to Malcolm. "Brother Malcolm," he said softly, "remember, the work is not about us. It's about the nation. Too much attention on one man can be dangerous." Malcolm nodded, but inside, the words unsettled him. He wasn't seeking fame, at least not for its own sake. He wanted the message to reach as many people as possible. But he could feel the shift in tone. This wasn't praise, this was a warning. Betty, his wife, noticed the weight on him when he came home that night. As they sat at the kitchen table, she poured him tea and asked, "What did he say?" Malcolm gave a small smile. "That I should remember it's not about me." Betty studied him. "Do you believe him?" He hesitated. "Yes, but sometimes I wonder if the work God calls you to can outgrow the place where you started." It was the first time he had put that thought into words, and once spoken, it couldn't be taken back, not even in the privacy of his own mind. Still, he kept working with the same intensity. In 1959, he traveled abroad for the first time, visiting the Middle East and Africa. He met leaders, saw Muslim communities living in dignity, and began to sense that Islam could be more than the nation's narrow vision. When he returned, he spoke about what he had seen, but carefully. The nation's teachings were strict, and anything that hinted at a different interpretation could be seen as disloyalty. What Malcolm didn't realize was that seeds were being planted on both sides. Seeds of doubt in his heart, and seeds of suspicion in the minds of those who feared what he might become. The stage was being set for a confrontation. It wouldn't come tomorrow or the next week, but it was coming. And when it arrived, it would force Malcolm to choose between the man who had mentored him and the truth he could no longer ignore. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X was no longer just a minister in the Nation of Islam. He was its public face. His speeches were appearing in national newspapers. Television crews invited him to debates, where his sharp wit and unshakable composure often left opponents scrambling for words. In cities where the nation had been unknown, his name was now on people's lips. His message was direct. We are not asking for anyone's permission to be free. To some, it was a call to dignity. To others, it was a warning of revolt. The movement grew rapidly under his watch. New temples opened. Men and women who had been lost to addiction or despair were now standing tall, wearing clean suits and long dresses, raising families with pride. In public, Malcolm gave credit to Elijah Muhammad for this transformation. But in private, more and more people were coming to Malcolm with their questions, their concerns, their gratitude. It was a dangerous shift. In a hierarchy built on absolute loyalty, being loved too much could be as risky as being hated. Malcolm didn't help matters by being everywhere. He spoke at universities and churches and community halls. He met foreign dignitaries. His image was in magazines, his interviews aired on primetime television. And always, he wore the same calm expression, never raising his voice in anger, yet somehow making the air in the room feel electric. Elijah Muhammad, now in his mid-60s, was still revered as the leader, but he rarely appeared in public. His health was delicate, his speeches few. The more the outside world saw of Malcolm, the more it began to confuse the messenger with the message. Some within the nation began to resent him. They whispered in Elijah's ear that Malcolm was becoming too big, too independent, that perhaps he was building his own following, preparing for something beyond the nation. Malcolm felt the chill in the air, but he ignored it at first. He believed that as long as he was loyal, the truth would protect him. Then came the trip to Los Angeles in April 1962. Two Muslim brothers from the nation were shot by police outside a mosque. One of them, Ronald Stokes, was killed. When Malcolm arrived, he saw the blood still on the pavement. Witnesses spoke of brutality, of unprovoked violence. Malcolm's voice shook with controlled fury as he addressed the press, demanding justice. The attention was instant. Headlines blazed with his words. Protesters gathered. For many, this was the first time they had heard the Nation of Islam speak directly against police violence. But within the leadership, the reaction was different. Elijah Muhammad called Malcolm and told him to let the matter go. "We do not get involved in the white man's politics," he reminded him. Malcolm obeyed outwardly, but inside, the command left a mark. Was silence in the face of injustice still righteous discipline, or was it fear? Betty noticed the heaviness in him when he returned to New York. At night, after the children were asleep, she would ask, "What's wrong?" Malcolm would shake his head. "Just thinking." "What about?" she'd press. He would look at her and say softly, "Whether following orders can sometimes mean turning your back on God's orders." That question would follow him in the months to come, growing louder with every step he took. And the next test, when it came, would not be about police bullets or public protests. It would be about the man he had built his faith upon. The year was 1963, and America was shifting beneath its own feet. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Marches filling streets, voices rising from church pulpits, and a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. becoming a national figure. From the Nation of Islam's standpoint, this movement was a distraction. They did not seek integration or legislative reform. Their mission was separation and self-reliance. Malcolm defended this position publicly, insisting the white man's political system could never deliver true justice. But privately, he watched the courage of those marching through the South and wondered. It was in the middle of this national turbulence that Malcolm heard whispers. Whispers he wanted to dismiss. Several young women within the nation confided quietly to others that Elijah Muhammad had fathered children with them outside of marriage. At first, Malcolm refused to believe it. To him, Elijah was more than a leader. He was a moral anchor, the man who had pulled him out of prison darkness and set him on a path of discipline and purpose. The idea that he could have broken the very moral code they preached felt impossible. But the rumors didn't fade. They grew louder. And finally, they reached Malcolm's ears from voices he trusted. The women themselves, hesitant and afraid, spoke of private meetings, of promises, of silence. Malcolm's first reaction was denial. This was the work of enemies, of the FBI, of jealous men in the ranks. But his certainty cracked when Elijah's own admission in a private conversation left no room for doubt. That night, Malcolm walked the streets of Harlem in a cold January wind, his coat collar turned up, his mind a storm. How do you reconcile the man who saved you with the man who betrayed the very teachings that salvation was built upon? At home, Betty saw it in his eyes before he said a word. They sat at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to bed. "Is it true?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded once. Betty reached across the table and took his hand. "So, what will you do?" Malcolm stared at their intertwined fingers. "I don't know yet, but if the truth makes me a traitor, then maybe I was never the kind of loyal they wanted." For months, he kept the conflict hidden from the public. He continued to speak, to open new temples to draw crowds that spilled into the streets. But inside, his loyalty was no longer blind. He began to see the nation's strict separation from the outside civil rights struggle as less like discipline and more like isolation. Then, in November of that same year, came a moment that would push him further from the nation than ever before: the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Elijah Muhammad gave a direct order. All ministers were to remain silent, offering no comment to the press. The nation feared government retaliation if any leader was seen as sympathetic to the act or using it for political points. Malcolm obeyed until a press conference where a reporter pressed him for his thoughts. His reply was brief, almost casual. "The chickens are coming home to roost." The phrase exploded across headlines. To the public, it sounded like he was saying Kennedy's death was deserved, that America's violence had finally turned inward. In the eyes of his critics, it confirmed every fear they had about him. Elijah Muhammad moved quickly. Malcolm was silenced. No public speaking, no interviews, no temple leadership. The suspension was indefinite. But for Malcolm, the silence was not punishment. It was a window, a space to think about where his true loyalty belonged. And in that quiet, the answer began to form. His allegiance was not to any man, not even the one who had rescued him from a prison cell. His allegiance was to the truth, wherever it led him. The trouble was, truth has a way of drawing enemies faster than lies. And Malcolm's enemies, both seen and unseen, were already closing in. The suspension was meant to keep him quiet. It had the opposite effect. By early 1964, Malcolm X was a man in motion, physically restricted by the nation's orders, but mentally roaming further than ever before. Without the weekly rhythm of speeches and temple meetings, he had time to read, to travel, to meet people outside the nation's closed circle. And what he found challenged everything he'd been taught to avoid. In Harlem, he attended quiet gatherings where civil rights leaders, African diplomats, and community activists shared strategies. He met with Muslim leaders outside the Nation of Islam's structure: Sunni, Shia, immigrants from Africa and the Middle East, men who spoke of Islam not as a racial doctrine, but as a faith that bound humanity together. The more he listened, the more he saw a horizon the nation had never shown him. But inside the movement he had served for over a decade, the air was turning poisonous. His suspension wasn't lifted. His phone lines were tapped. His home phone would ring late at night, only for the caller to hang up. Men he'd known for years began to avoid his eyes. One afternoon, as he walked down a Harlem street, a man from the nation crossed the road to avoid passing him. It was a small thing, but it carried the weight of a verdict. Malcolm understood what it meant. He was no longer Brother Malcolm in their eyes. He was drifting toward enemy territory. Then came the meeting with Elijah Muhammad. It was brief, awkward. They sat across from each other, the air thick with unspoken history. Elijah's voice was quiet but heavy. "You should have stayed silent, Malcolm." "About Kennedy? About me." Malcolm met his gaze. "I can't follow a man over God, sir." That was the last time they would speak face to face. In March 1964, Malcolm X formally announced his departure from the Nation of Islam. The press swarmed him. He told them he was starting a new organization, the Muslim Mosque, Inc. and that he was now embracing a more traditional Islam. His words were careful, but the implication was clear. He was breaking free from the control of the man who had shaped him. For the first time in years, Malcolm felt light. There was fear, yes, but also possibility. He was no longer bound by rules that kept him isolated from the wider world. He began planning a pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey he hoped would confirm the faith he had only glimpsed from a distance. But freedom has a price, and Malcolm soon realized that leaving the nation didn't just mean losing a title. It meant making enemies of men who knew his every habit, his every weakness, his every route home. Threats began to arrive. Anonymous letters, phone calls with whispered warnings. A man approached him outside a meeting and murmured, "You won't last the year." Betty urged caution, locking doors, keeping the children close. But Malcolm had never been one to live in hiding. "If I die," he told her one night, "it'll be doing what I believe is right." That spring, he boarded a plane to Saudi Arabia for the pilgrimage that would change him forever. The journey began with heat, dry desert air that wrapped around him like an oven. But the moment he stepped into the sacred city of Mecca, surrounded by Muslims of every color and language, his heart shifted. Here were white men and black men praying shoulder to shoulder, sharing meals, calling each other brother. It was not the segregated vision he'd been taught. It was a living picture of unity. In letters to friends back home, he wrote of tears falling on the marble floor of the Kaaba, of the overwhelming sense that God's truth was bigger than race, bigger than the bitterness of America. This was the moment Malcolm's voice would change forever. Not in its fire, but in its scope. When he returned to the United States, he would speak of justice, not just for Black Americans, but for humanity. He would talk of alliances, of building bridges, of dismantling oppression wherever it lived. But in doing so, he would walk directly into the crosshairs of those who saw his transformation not as growth, but as betrayal. And betrayal, in their eyes, was a sin punishable by death. When Malcolm stepped off the plane from Mecca in May 1964, reporters noticed something different. The man who had once spoken of the white man as the devil now spoke of the human family. He told them about men with blue eyes and blonde hair, who had treated him as a brother, who had shared food from the same bowl, and prayed beside him without suspicion or superiority. True Islam, he said, removes the cancer of racism from the human heart. It was not a rejection of his fight for black dignity, far from it, but it was a shift from separatism to a broader vision. He now saw America's racial struggle as part of a global human struggle. He wasted no time putting that vision to work. Within weeks, Malcolm began reaching out to civil rights leaders he had once criticized, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He also met with leaders from Africa and the Middle East, exploring the idea of bringing America's racial injustice before the United Nations as a human rights issue. His new message resonated with many, but it also drew sharper knives from his enemies. Inside the Nation of Islam, leaders branded him a traitor. His speeches were monitored, his phone tapped. FBI reports noted an increased threat to Malcolm X's life from both internal and external sources. Even in public, the tension was visible. At rallies, men in dark suits would appear in the back rows, their eyes locked on Malcolm, but their faces unreadable. In the streets of Harlem, familiar faces would turn away as he passed. At home, the tension was more intimate. Betty was proud of his courage, but she saw the cost. Late at night, Malcolm would pace the living room, his mind racing with plans, his ears tuned to every sound outside. One evening, as the children slept, Betty said, "You can't fight the whole world, Malcolm." He stopped pacing and looked at her. "I'm not trying to fight the whole world. I'm trying to tell the truth. But sometimes..." He trailed off, his gaze distant. "Sometimes what?" she asked. He shook his head. "Sometimes I think the truth is what gets you killed." In June, he formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, modeled after the Organization of African Unity he'd seen in Africa. Its mission was bold: unite people of African descent worldwide, promote self-determination, and build political and economic strength without relying on a system designed to weaken them. But the threats escalated. His home was firebombed in February 1965 while his family was inside. By some miracle, they escaped unharmed. Standing in the cold with smoke curling into the night sky, Malcolm looked at the smoldering ruins and knew there was no going back to safety. Not now, not ever. Still, he refused to cancel his speeches. "If I die," he told a friend, "I'll die with my boots on, telling the truth as I see it." And so, the date was set for his next appearance. February 21st, 1965, at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. He didn't know it yet, but that day would be his last. The week before February 21st, 1965 felt different. For months, Malcolm had grown used to the threats, the anonymous phone calls, the men who followed him in cars that stopped when he stopped, the strangers in the back of the room at his speeches. But now, the tension had sharpened into something heavier, like the air before a storm. On Monday, he told a close friend, "I know they're going to kill me. It could be any day now. But what kind of man would I be if I stopped telling the truth because of that?" The friend urged him to lay low, to leave the city for a while. Malcolm smiled faintly and shook his head. "If it's going to happen, it'll happen. God controls my time, not them." At home, Betty saw it too. She noticed how he lingered longer with the children, how he touched their faces as if memorizing every detail. Late one night, after tucking them in, he sat in the living room, the only light coming from a small lamp by the couch. Betty joined him, and for a long time they sat in silence. Finally, she said, "I'm scared for you." He turned to her, his voice steady. "I'm not afraid to die, Betty. I'm afraid to live a lie." On Friday, Malcolm spoke at a meeting for the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He laid out plans for international alliances, for economic independence, for confronting America on the world stage. His tone was passionate but calm, as if he knew these words might be among his last. The night before the Audubon Ballroom event, he reviewed his notes at the kitchen table. Betty watched him from the doorway. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked. Malcolm looked up and smiled softly. "I don't want to do this. I have to." The morning of February 21st dawned cold but clear. Malcolm rose early, dressed neatly in his dark suit, and ate breakfast with his family. He kissed each of his daughters on the forehead, then lingered with Betty for a moment longer than usual. At the ballroom, the crowd began to gather, families, students, supporters. The air buzzed with anticipation. People took their seats, unaware that hidden among them were men who had come for a different purpose. Backstage, Malcolm waited calmly, speaking quietly with his security team. He adjusted his tie, ran a hand over his head, and took a deep breath. It was almost time, but there was a weight in the air, an invisible heaviness that even those who didn't believe in omens might have felt. And in just a few minutes, history would feel it too. The Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights wasn't grand. It was functional. A wide hall with rows of folding chairs, a small stage at the front, and balconies that wrapped around like watchful eyes. By 3 p.m., nearly 400 people had filled the space. The chatter was warm, expectant. For many in the crowd, this was their first time seeing Malcolm X in person. Near the front sat families with children, students with notebooks ready, older men in neatly pressed suits. In the back, however, the mood was different. Men leaned against the walls, their eyes scanning the crowd, their faces unreadable. Malcolm was in a small side room off stage, speaking quietly with one of his aides. He had his usual calm, but there was something else in his eyes, a depth, as if he had already made peace with whatever came next. His security detail was thinner than usual. Some members had drifted away in recent weeks, citing disagreements or other duties. He knew it left him vulnerable. Still, he insisted the event go forward. "Brother Malcolm," one guard said softly, "you know there's been talk." Malcolm nodded. "There's always talk, but the truth still has to be told." At 3:15 p.m., the meeting began. One of the OAAU leaders stepped up to the podium, greeting the audience and speaking about the organization's goals. Malcolm stood just off stage, listening, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. Betty was seated near the front with their daughters. She glanced at him once, catching his eye. He gave her the faintest smile, steady, reassuring. When the announcer finally said, "I present to you Brother Malcolm," applause filled the room. Malcolm walked to the podium with his usual unhurried steps, nodding to a few faces he recognized. He stood tall, adjusting the microphone. "Assalamu alaikum," he began, his voice strong and warm. "Wa alaikum salam," the crowd responded. For a moment, it felt like any other speech. He spoke of unity, of the need for self-determination, of connecting the struggles in America to struggles abroad. The audience leaned forward, listening closely. Then, commotion. A man in the middle row stood up, shouting, "Get your hands out of my pocket!" Another man rose, responding angrily. People turned in their seats, distracted by the argument. Malcolm's eyes flicked toward the disturbance. He raised a hand as if to calm the room. "Now, brothers." The first shot cracked like a whip. Then another, and another. In the chaos, people screamed and dove for the floor. Chairs clattered, children cried out. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Malcolm fell back against the stage, then collapsed. His bodyguard rushed to him, but it was too late. The bullets had already found their mark. Betty screamed, running forward. She knelt beside him, cradling his head. Blood pooled around them as the room dissolved into panic. And in that moment, the voice that had challenged a nation, that had risen from prison walls to speak to the world, fell silent. For a moment after the gunfire stopped, the ballroom was frozen in a strange, terrible silence. Then, the sound rushed back all at once. Screams, sobs, the scraping of chairs as people scrambled toward the exits. A few men tried to chase the gunmen, but in the chaos, most disappeared into the panicked crowd. On the stage, Betty Shabazz knelt over her husband's body, her hands pressed against the wounds, her voice breaking as she called his name. Blood soaked through her fingers, staining her dress. Around her, members of his security team formed a protective circle, shouting for someone to call an ambulance. One man, photographer Earl Grant, stood frozen for a second before instinct took over. He dropped his camera and knelt beside Betty. "Stay with me, Malcolm," he whispered urgently. "Stay with me." Malcolm's eyes fluttered, his breathing shallow, then stopped. The medics arrived minutes later, pushing through the crowd. They lifted him onto a stretcher, his body limp, his once commanding frame now a still weight under the white sheet. Betty followed close behind, their daughters clinging to her skirt, their faces pale with confusion and fear. At Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, doctors worked frantically, the waiting room filled with supporters, reporters, and plainclothes police. An hour later, the doctor emerged, his face solemn. "I'm sorry, he's gone." Betty closed her eyes and took a breath that seemed to hold the whole weight of the world. She was 28 years old, widowed, with 4 young children and twins on the way. News of Malcolm's assassination swept across the country within hours. Radio broadcasts interrupted programs. Television stations ran grainy black and white footage of the scene. Newspapers rushed to print extra editions. In Harlem, crowds gathered on street corners, their voices low, their faces stunned. Some wept openly. Others stood in silence, anger simmering under the surface. In some quarters, the reaction was colder. Malcolm had been a polarizing figure, and not everyone mourned his passing. But even his critics could not deny that a powerful voice had been silenced. That night, Betty returned home to the quiet of their apartment. The children had fallen asleep, exhaustion from the day's terror finally overtaking them. She sat at the kitchen table alone, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. She thought of his final weeks, the firebombing of their home, the warnings from friends, the way he had lingered over the children before leaving that morning. She realized now that he had been preparing for this, not in fear, but in acceptance. And she thought of his last words to her the night before. "I have to." The next day, crowds lined the streets for his funeral procession. Inside the Faith Temple Church of God, thousands filed past his open casket. Some touched his hand, others whispered prayers, others simply looked and walked away in silence. Outside, the winter wind carried the sound of a lone voice reciting a prayer in Arabic, simple, steady, unshaken. In death, Malcolm X had become something larger than a man. He had become a mirror. For some, he reflected the courage to speak truth to power. For others, he reflected the danger of challenging entrenched systems. But for those who had walked with him, even briefly, he reflected a journey from ignorance to knowledge, from hatred to a broader love, from self-destruction to service. Yet, in that moment, the legacy was still forming. The question was not only how he would be remembered, but what his absence would mean for the struggles still ahead. And in that question, history was already beginning to turn its next page. In the weeks after Malcolm X's assassination, Harlem felt different. The corner stores still opened. The trains still rumbled. Children still played in the streets. But there was a heaviness in the air, a quiet awareness that something irreplaceable had been taken. His image, sharp suit, intense eyes, appeared in shop windows and on hand-painted posters, often accompanied by the words, "Our brother, our voice." Betty Shabazz moved with deliberate grace through her grief. She was now the widow of a man celebrated and vilified in equal measure. Her days became a careful balancing act, protecting her children, managing the attention from the media, and holding her head high in a city that both honored and feared the name Malcolm X. Letters began arriving from all over the world. Some were from strangers, thanking Malcolm for giving them courage. Others came from leaders in Africa and the Middle East, offering condolences and promising to keep his vision alive. But not all letters were kind. Threats continued, proving that even in death, Malcolm's voice still unsettled those who preferred silence. Betty decided she would not let her husband's name be defined solely by the headlines written in the heat of his conflicts. She began accepting speaking invitations, telling audiences about the Malcolm they didn't see on television, the man who read to his daughters at night, who prayed before meals, who believed fiercely in the power of education to free the mind. Meanwhile, the Organization of Afro-American Unity he founded struggled without him. Without Malcolm's leadership and charisma, it lacked the momentum to match his vision. But the seeds he planted, the idea that Black America's fight for justice was part of a larger global human rights struggle, began to take root in other movements. In the broader civil rights landscape, something unexpected happened. The very leaders who had once kept their distance from Malcolm now began to speak of him differently. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had disagreed with Malcolm's militant tone, acknowledged his great ability to put the finger on the existence and root of the problem. Younger activists, like those in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, began to embrace Malcolm's message of self-determination. In the years that followed, his speeches, recorded, transcribed, and passed from hand to hand, found new audiences. On college campuses, in community centers, in small apartments, where young people debated their futures, Malcolm's words were studied like scripture. But perhaps the most enduring transformation was the one within those who had once misunderstood him. As time passed, more people began to see the arc of his life, not as one of anger, but of evolution. An evolution from street hustler to minister, from minister to global thinker, from separatist to believer in a brotherhood that crossed racial lines. Betty gave birth to their twin daughters months after his death. Looking at their faces, she felt the ache of what they would never know. The sound of his laughter, the way he held their sisters close, the fire in his eyes when he spoke about justice. But she also felt something steadier, the knowledge that they would grow up knowing the truth about their father, not the caricature. In 1965, the autobiography of Malcolm X, co-written with journalist Alex Haley, was published. It revealed the man behind the headlines, the losses that shaped him, the anger that drove him, the faith that transformed him. Readers found in its pages not just a political figure, but a human being wrestling with God, with himself, and with the world. The book traveled far beyond America's borders, inspiring people from Africa to Asia, from the Caribbean to Europe. It became a lifeline for prisoners, students, activists, and anyone who had been told They were less than what God intended them to be. Malcolm's voice was gone, but his words had learned to walk without him. And those words, in the decades to come, would prove harder to silence than any man. As the years rolled on, Malcolm X became more than a name. He became a symbol. In the late 1960s and 1970s, his image began to appear in murals and posters alongside leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Kwame Nkrumah. For some, he was the uncompromising voice of resistance. For others, he was the cautionary tale of what happens when a man challenges too much, too fast. But for those who studied his life closely, he was something more complicated and more inspiring. Young activists embraced him as proof that transformation was possible. They didn't just quote his words about resistance. They studied his later speeches about unity, his reflections on Mecca, his calls for global solidarity. They saw a man who had begun in anger and ended in vision, a man whose faith deepened as his worldview expanded. In classrooms, his autobiography was read not just as history, but as testimony. Teachers used it to show that redemption was not a single moment, but a journey marked by difficult choices. Prison literacy programs often placed the autobiography of Malcolm X in the hands of inmates who saw in his story a mirror of their own. Proof that even from the depths of confinement, a mind could be set free. Betty Shabazz carried the work forward quietly but persistently. She earned her doctorate in education, raised her 6 daughters, and became an advocate for human rights and education reform. She rarely spoke publicly about the details of Malcolm's assassination, choosing instead to focus on the values he stood for. Her presence kept his memory anchored in dignity rather than tragedy. In time, even the American mainstream began to reassess Malcolm X. Documentaries, academic conferences, and museum exhibits painted a fuller portrait of his life. The man once branded as a dangerous radical was now recognized as one of the most important voices of the 20th century, a man whose call for self-respect, education, and moral courage transcended race and politics. But the reevaluation also brought deeper questions. Was Malcolm's transformation inevitable, or was it a fragile miracle that could have been lost, if not for a few pivotal moments? Was his break from the Nation of Islam an act of betrayal, or the ultimate act of faithfulness to God? And perhaps the most haunting, if he had lived longer, how might America and the world be different today? These questions lingered not just in academic halls, but in living rooms, barbershops, mosques, and churches. His story forced people to confront the uncomfortable truth that leaders are human, that they grow, change, and sometimes outgrow the movements that raise them. Internationally, Malcolm's influence rippled across continents. In South Africa, anti-apartheid activists cited his speeches as a source of courage. In the Caribbean, he was remembered as a son of the African diaspora, who spoke for those without a voice. In the Middle East, Muslims respected his journey to Mecca as a sincere search for truth, unmarred by political convenience. By the late 1980s, a new generation was rediscovering Malcolm X. Hip-hop artists sampled his speeches, weaving his words into beats that echoed in clubs and street corners. Filmmakers began exploring his life, culminating in Spike Lee's 1992 film Malcolm X, which brought his story to millions who had never read his book or heard his speeches. The world saw his face, eyes fierce, finger pointing upward, not as a symbol of division, but as a challenge. What will you stand for? And perhaps that was Malcolm's true legacy. Not the man, not even the message in its entirety, but the mirror he held up to every listener. A mirror that asked again and again, are you living by fear or by the truth you claim to believe? Even decades after his assassination, Malcolm X's words still have a way of arriving at the right moment, cutting through noise with clarity. In the 21st century, his speeches have found new life on screens and in the streets. Protesters hold up signs bearing his quotes, "You can't separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom." Social media clips of his interviews circulate widely, his calm dismantling of injustice resonating with audiences who weren't even born when he lived. It isn't only activists who invoke him. Teachers in classrooms use his autobiography to spark discussions on resilience, morality, and personal transformation. Faith leaders reference his pilgrimage to Mecca when speaking about unity across racial and cultural lines. Even corporate diversity seminars sometimes quote him, though often carefully, avoiding the sharper edges of his truth-telling. But in the communities he loved most, places like Harlem, Detroit, and Boston, his presence feels less like a historical figure and more like a familiar voice still speaking from the corner. Murals keep his gaze fixed on the streets he once walked. Elders tell stories of the first time they heard him speak, describing how it made them stand taller. Young people read his life story and realize they are not trapped by where they started. Yet, his legacy is not simple. Some still see him as a man too uncompromising, too unwilling to bend to political pragmatism. Others argue that it was his refusal to dilute the truth that gave his words their lasting power. And many find inspiration in the arc of his transformation, the way he was willing to shed old beliefs when he found a higher truth, even if it cost him his place in the movement he had built. In recent years, as new struggles for racial justice have emerged, Malcolm's life has become a touchstone for moral questions that feel timeless. What does it mean to speak truth to power when it risks your safety? Can a person truly change? Or do we only learn to hide our flaws? When loyalty to a leader conflicts with loyalty to God's truth, which should prevail? For those who have studied his life, the answers are not abstract. They are lived examples. Malcolm didn't just ask these questions, he walked through them. His journey shows the cost of living by conviction, but also the peace that comes from knowing you didn't compromise your core beliefs. In Muslim communities around the world, his name is often spoken with respect, not just for his conversion to Orthodox Islam, but for the humility he showed in acknowledging that he had been wrong before. In African nations, he is remembered as a bridge between the diaspora and the continent, a man who refused to let borders or politics limit his vision of unity. Even those who once opposed him have, in some cases, admitted the depth of his commitment to justice. Former critics have spoken publicly about how his death left a vacuum, one that no one has fully filled. And yet, Malcolm himself might have resisted being turned into an icon. He often said, "I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it's for or against." It was a reminder that movements are bigger than individuals, that the work must outlive the worker. Today, when his voice plays through a loudspeaker at a rally, when his face appears on a mural in a city far from where he lived, when a young person opens his autobiography and sees themselves in those early chapters, his story begins again. And perhaps that is the real measure of a life well lived. Not how loudly the world applauds when you are gone, but how deeply your courage continues to plant seeds in hearts you will never meet. Malcolm X's journey was never a straight line. It began in the shadows of loss and poverty, ran through the glitter and danger of Harlem's nightlife, wound into the rigid discipline of the Nation of Islam, and then broke open into the wide horizon of a global faith. At each turn, he shed something, an illusion, a false loyalty, a version of himself that could no longer stand in the light. Some remember him for his fire in the early years, the way his words struck like lightning. Others remember him for his calm in the final months, the way his voice carried a weight of clarity, as if he had found the coordinates of truth and was determined to walk toward them, no matter the cost. For those willing to look closely, his life offers a pattern. Pain sharpened his focus, discipline forged his strength, and faith softened his edges without dulling his courage. He showed that conviction is not about never changing. It is about changing when God shows you a higher truth. And in that, perhaps, lies his most enduring lesson. We are not defined by the point at which the world first meets us. We are defined by the direction we choose to walk once we know better. Think about it. This was a man who, by the age of 20, had been a hustler, a gambler, a prisoner. In the eyes of most, his story should have ended there. in obscurity or an early grave. But when knowledge came to him, when faith took root, he didn't just clean up his life. He redirected it entirely towards service. And when he discovered that the truth was bigger than the walls he had built around it, he stepped outside those walls, even knowing it would make him a target. That choice, leaving the comfort of a leader's protection for the uncertainty of God's calling, is one that cost him everything. Yet, it is also the reason his story is still told, still studied, still felt today. We like to imagine courage as a roar, but sometimes it is a quiet, steady step in the right direction, taken with the full knowledge that danger waits ahead. Malcolm's final months were full of those steps. Every speech, every handshake, every plane ticket booked was an act of defiance against fear. There's a reason his words still find new ears. They don't belong to a single era, because the questions he wrestled with are not bound by time. What will you stand for when standing costs you everything? How do you reconcile loyalty to people with loyalty to God's truth? And when the road you're on ends in darkness, will you turn back or keep walking toward the light you've glimpsed ahead? These are not just Malcolm's questions. They are ours, and they will follow each of us in some form until we answer them. In the end, his legacy is not about the man on the podium, the photographs, or even the words printed in books. It is about the echo that remains in the heart after you've heard his story, the part that whispers, "What about you?" Because if a man can go from a prison cell to the steps of Mecca, from hatred to a love that spanned the human family, from being defined by others to defining himself before God, then perhaps we too can walk a road we once thought impossible. History often remembers leaders for the battles they fought, but sometimes their truest legacy lies in the battles they fought within themselves. Malcolm X's life was full of victories and scars, public applause and private trials. Yet, the most important turning points were not the speeches that shook crowds or the debates that left opponents silent. They were the moments when he stood at a crossroads, alone with God, and chose the harder path. He chose it when he left the streets for the discipline of faith. He chose it again when he left blind loyalty for a broader truth. And he chose it one last time when he returned from Mecca determined to speak of unity in a world that wanted him divided. Every choice carried a cost, and the final cost was his life. But the question his story leaves us with is not whether the cost was worth it, because Malcolm's life answers that without words. The question is, when it is your turn to stand for truth, will you accept the cost? Malcolm showed us that change is not weakness, it is growth. That faith is not a prison, it is a compass. And that loyalty, when given, must never outweigh our duty to what is right before God. Perhaps the most beautiful part of his journey is that it did not begin with perfection. It began with brokenness, with loss, with mistakes. And maybe that is why his story continues to resonate, because it reminds us that our past is not our prison. It is the soil from which something greater can grow, if we are willing to let God tend it. So tonight, as we let the fire crackle low and the room grow quiet, let's take one more look at the man we've walked beside. Not as an untouchable icon, but as a fellow traveler who dared to follow truth wherever it led, even when it led into the storm. Because in the end, the storms pass, but the courage to face them, that's what remains. Thank you for being here tonight, for listening, for holding this story with the care it deserves. It means more than you know to share this fireside circle with you. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.